It's time to learn from my mistakes. Let's summarize.
I drafted a 4-gore skirt pattern based upon my measurements, but I decided to get fancy and cut the skirt on the bias. This resulted in a Chinese finger trap around my hips. I then pulled my entire library and wrote down everything that was said about sewing on the bias. This resulted in me realizing that my library was lacking, and I made book purchases for future projects. So instead of continuing to fight with sewing on the bias, I cut the exact same pattern out again, but on the grain. This informed me that I had in fact also changed sizes, yet again. Therefore, I redrafted my flat knee sloper pattern using industry standards where skirt patterns need less fabric in the back than the front. This had a better result, but still not quite right due to my overarched back, aka sway back, and this pulls the side seam to the back. I also recognize that I just need more ease in general, so I tried again. I ignored industry standards and divided the high hip and the low hip measurements in half, and I did not move any material from the back to the front. The waist, I continued to follow standard drafting. It worked, so I redrafted my 4-gore 1940s A-line skirt pattern and sewed an on-the-grain, lovely blue linen skirt. First, trace your front flat U pattern, which has ease but no seam allowance. Divide the pattern in half through the dart. Close the dart. This allows the bottom of the skirt to spread out, which gives you a lovely A-line shape. Use your French curve to smooth the hemline. Trace your back flat U pattern, which also has ease but no seam allowance. Divide the pattern in half through the dart. On the back, I chose to partially close the dart. This allowed the bottom of the skirt to spread out, but at a reasonable amount. If I had closed this dart completely, I'd have easily added about 8 inches at the bottom, which in the end would be a full 16 inches across the back. That wasn't the look that I was going for, and I don't have enough material for that. Let's begin. Iron your fabric. This is not optional. Trace the pattern. Mark everything. Do not forget that this pattern does not have seam allowance. For me, the sides and hem get a full inch for seam allowance, and the waist gets a ½ inch of seam allowance. The darts are thread marked as well as chalk marked. Iron and sew the darts. French seam the front seam together and iron. French seam the back seam and insert the zipper. I'm hand basting in the zipper to ensure a far more accurate lay, and then I hand sew the zipper in. I am now in love with my zippers, and you know from prior episodes that I have been disgusted with my zippers up to now. French seam the sides, do some fancy sewing to put in the waistband, and know that this was some super cool footage that is utterly missing, and once you sew the hem, you have a finished 1948 A-line skirt. But first, let me share with you what my library says about sewing on the bias, as that really was the primary issue from last week's sew.
Just got my hair cut, and this is following me editing a bunch of video, realizing that the audio for what I'm about to do was terrible. So I'm redoing it, and you get the pleasure of seeing a modern haircut on me. All right. There's nothing quite like a new haircut. It just gets flippy and fun, and I've got a lot more hair, and I'm really proud of myself. I didn't go in and do anything drastic. I did a maintenance haircut. Go me. This is a thing. I've had problems with this in the past. Okay, this is the sum total of what my library actually has to say about sewing on the bias. According to Apparel Making in Fashion Design, when sewing on the bias, the pattern's grain line is positioned on the bias, typically at a 45-degree angle. Fabrics cut on the bias result in garments that drape softly. However, this method requires more fabric. Collars, cuffs, and yokes exhibit enhanced effectiveness when crafted on the bias, particularly when using striped or plaid fabric. I don't know about you, but that was not entirely all that useful. The pattern making primer includes a section on flat pattern drafting for a front or deep back cowl that employs the bias. It advises against cutting bias shapes on a fold, recommending the mirroring of the pattern piece for the most successful cut. This is reflected in all of the comments on my last video as well. In the Definitive Visual History of Fashion, page 65, they present a Neapolitan illumination from 1350 and notes that the hose depicted is crafted from wool fabric cut out on the bias to allow for stretching around the leg. On page 274, a notable shift is observed at the close of the 1920s as the relatively brief reign of the short evening dress comes to an end and the fashionable trend transitions to long figure-hugging gowns. These dresses, frequently cut on the lines of swimwear, are suspended delicately from the thinnest of shoulder straps, exposing the backs of wearers. Shiny fluid fabrics such as satin and lame cut on the bias are skillfully crafted into confections that tightly adhere to the contours of the body. Bias cut exists. In Patterns of Fashion by Janet Arnold on page 158, you see two examples of bias cut dresses, but no actual advice past that. Still a phenomenal book. The Vintage Pattern Selector on page 71 talks about circle skirts. This page explains the crazy large waist that I ended up cutting out on the circle skirt. A circle skirt waist is a variable bias cut. It will stretch out, especially if you handle it a lot. This led me to a completely different research rabbit hole, and how much to reduce the waist measurement by is described vastly different across so many different sources. This is now a noted thing for me. For when I do make another circle skirt, I'll be digging into the math and the waist measurement and how exactly I'm going to do that in the future. In Berta's Style, Modern Sewing, it says, follow the grain line parallel to the selvage and to avoid the bias. In So Many Dresses, So Little Time, the Ultimate Dressmaking Guide, on page 150. Garments cut out on the bias are derived from a whole pattern rather than a half pattern, and they are not cut on the fold. Make sure that you pick the right fabric and opt for a drapey fabric with high stability and a tight weave, such as crepe. Cutting on the bias allows the fabric to stretch around the body, facilitating fitting over curves without the need for darts. It does not say don't use darts. It says that darts aren't supposed to be necessary here. However, it's essential to be aware that bias cut garments also tend to stretch downward, leading to potential issues such as twisty seams or an altered fit. Use an inexpensive fabric that closely resembles the material you intend to use. Spend whatever you need to in order to be able to resemble your final fabric. Otherwise, it's not going to be a very good muslin. And that's for on the grain or on the bias. Increase your seam allowance to provide fabric stability as well as flexibility for reshaping side seams if necessary. Always hang the fabric you plan to use on the bias, muslin fabric too, for approximately a week before cutting. This automatically means that a bias cut anything is not a quickie project. That should be noted on a calendar, and you need to have a plan. This will allow the fabric to undergo most of its downward stretching, ensuring better results during the cutting process. After sewing the skirt, allow it to hang for a few days before hemming to achieve an even hemline. In Sewing Made Easy, on page 77, it says that when stitching a bias edge to a straight edge, always prioritize having the bias edge on the top. So have the curved part on the bias, and then on the grain, and then this goes through the sewing machine. This approach allows you to adjust the fullness as you stitch ensuring a precise and even outcome. Ooh, one more book. In Cutting and Fitting, 1938, it suggests marking the direction of the nape to ensure that you don't try to mix the direction, the lay of the fabric when you're cutting out. So in other words, this is up, this is down. And that is the sum total of what is said on bias in my library. I was genuinely expecting more. I was genuinely thinking that somewhere, especially in my 1930s books, that there'd be more. I was wildly wrong, so I obviously needed to buy some more books. Am I going to tell you what's in these books right now? Absolutely not. I have not read them yet. So let's go back in the past and put together my outfit. So future me is taking care of past me, and yeah, this makes sense, totally. Time portal.
First, my black Place Saver shoes that I have until I get proper penny loafers for the days that wearing heels is just silly. Long black warm socks because it's entirely too cold to wear anything else. A slip that will go nicely under a sleeveless white blouse from Quincy, a gray short cashmere cardigan also from Quincy, and finally my blue linen wrinkly skirt.